Good afternoon, and we have a fantastic panel here in the room as well as online. What we'll do is we'll just start by noting that this is a huge topic, a huge agenda, climate smart agriculture. It's top of mind. Agriculture, as we all know, everybody in the room is aware of the importance and the duality of climate smart actions vis-a-vis agriculture. One, to sort of protect and ensure that the productivity, resilience, and income and job creation potential of agriculture is safeguarded, but on the other hand, to address the aspects of mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. It's such a huge topic. We thought we'd start by taking a look at some of the major supply chains. So we are starting today with livestock systems, and we have a fantastic panel here to get us initiated. We also have a couple of people speaking to the issue from outside of the sort of World Bank complex, and we welcome that. We have, of course, with us Tim Searchinger, who's a research scholar at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and I believe you're there today, Tim. He's also a senior fellow at the World Resources International, where he serves as a technical director of its food program. He is today presenting, I believe, some overarching thoughts on agri-food systems and climate change, and might also give us a sense of how WRI is approaching this key pillar within its new strategic directions. Next, of course, we have Jimmy Smith. Jimmy Smith was, up until fairly recently, a Director General of ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute. He led also the global livestock portfolio at the World Bank. And Jimmy today will be speaking to us of his work focused on livestock research for sustainable development. We have Howard Shee from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, also supported by WRI and several other partners. Howard has extensive financial sector experience across the US, Europe, and Asia, and today he presents an overview of the SBTI framework for financial institutions to set near-term emissions reduction targets. And he'll also touch on the SBTI's forest land agriculture guidance. Next on will be Luz Diaz Rios. She's a practitioner. She's a senior agriculture or agribusiness rather specialist at the World Bank, currently working in the ECA region. Luz has extensive experience in agricultural and value chain development work across different regions, and she will speak of her experiences, including in Colombia, where she managed a much storied Ganadero Sostenible project. So that's Luz. And then last but not the least, we have Felix Teilhard Derry. Felix is a livestock and climate change specialist with experience from both FAO and the World Bank, working on livestock sustainability issues. He will be speaking about experiences and resources to enhance the contribution of the bank to climate smart livestock systems, in operations and in the context of the broader climate change action plan that the World Bank put out a couple of years back. He will also touch on the investment in sustainable livestock guide that the bank has prepared for bank staff, but it might give us a sense of the how to do part of today's discussion. And then we'll wrap up with a few minutes for any questions and answers and any thoughts for the panel. Thank you. So over to you, Tim.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. I like to start with an advertisement, which is this 550-page report we did with the World Bank on basically all of these questions, including, above all, sustainable livestock at the end of the day, because livestock are the single critical challenge in agriculture for climate and land use. Let me go on to the next slide. So, of course, the bottom line, I mean, one of the key things I want to emphasize is that for livestock, it's land use, and for agriculture in generally, it's land use first and above all that we have to be concerned with. So agriculture is half of all the world's vegetated land, and livestock are at least 75% of that. If you'll go on. If you try to kind of think about the greenhouse gas costs of that, people tend to focus on just land use change, but land use change assumes that all of the land that has already been devoted to agriculture is somehow free from a climate perspective. And if you think about the fact that we're even assigned like a little rental cost, you can think of it, to all the carbon we have lost from all of that land, it is the land use cost above all that is the critical greenhouse gas cost. So here what you see from a paper in Nature are the greenhouse gas costs of different foods, and what you see is that it is the land use cost, which is the little checkered numbers rather, or part of the bar rather than the orange part of the bar, that is the dominant cost. So both for production emissions, which are the orange part of the bar, orange-brown, livestock are, of course, much, much higher, particularly beef, than other foods, but the land use is what makes it truly enormous. Land use is the overwhelming cost. When you factor in the cost of land, agriculture is about 3/4 of the greenhouse gas cost of the energy sector. If you kind of assign to agriculture kind of a rental cost of all the carbon lost on the land. If you'll move on, next slide. So, of course, from a production emissions standpoint, this is also the case. So here, what you see on the right are just the production emissions, production methane, nitrous oxide, energy use. And the critical thing here you see is that the reddish stuff is basically ruminants. So ruminant production, right, basically cattle, sheep, and goats, are the bulk of the emissions in agriculture. That doesn't even include some of the soil fertilization emissions. Not all of the manure is ruminants, but basically, ruminants are the key: cows, sheep, and goats. Next slide. And of course, we have relentless growing demand for meat and milk. You can kind of see it charting up like that. We projected about a 70% increase in demand for meat and milk from 2010 to 2050. And the question is, how do we simultaneously try to meet that demand? What I'm not going to show you are slides that even if the wealthy dramatically reduce their meat and milk, 2/3 of the people who are going to live in 2050 consume about 1/4 of the meat and milk of people in the West. And as they get wealthier and consume even a little bit more, we're going to see large increases. So that means we have to make livestock production more efficient. Next slide. Now, we're also facing the fact that the best information is quite different from FAO stats, and that we are having massive expansion of cropland. And so this was a study that came out about a year ago, the first kind of high-quality satellite study, and basically suggests we're expanding at a rate that over a 40-year period, or 30-year period even, would basically be more than the size of India. And actually, if you click again, the gross land use change is about twice the net land use change. In other words, we're clearing 2 hectares of land for cropland and then allowing 1 hectare somewhere to reforest or reestablish something else, and that the real emissions are even higher. Next slide. Now, some people tend to think, if you look at FAO statistics, that pasture is not expanding because in FAO statistics, it's not expanding on a global basis. That's probably mainly due to bad statistics, but even if you agreed with it, the reason for that is that countries like Australia are basically declaring that a lot of the outback is no longer considered pasture. And so you basically see this huge decline in pasture in Australia's official statistics, which is basically desert. But if you look at the world's forests, the next slide, the world's forests are being cleared primarily for direct use by cattle. So we are also seeing, in addition to that, land use change for cattle. Next slide. So one of the theories, which I'm going to take issue with, is the idea that we're going to somehow have lower carbon or even carbon neutral beef because we're going to somehow have soil carbon gains on this land that will kind of offset the methane emitted by beef. And so this is the idea. You convert cropland to grassland. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see kind of claims that we can have carbon neutral beef in Europe, claims, next slide, carbon neutral beef in the US, because of course, if you convert, no, keep going back. If you convert cropland to pasture, you will sequester carbon. But the problem is you produce about 1/10 the food. So all you're really doing is transferring the loss of carbon somewhere else. We can't, given the land use challenge, we can't solve our problems by taking a cropland and turning it into pasture. We do have to improve pasture, but not turn cropland into pasture. Next slide. So, okay, what can we do? Well, one of the things we know is there are dramatic differences in the efficiency of livestock production in different parts of the world. And I've come to believe this is a chart from a famous 2013 paper. I think now it's somewhat exaggerated, the differences. This is not even counting land use, but you see really multifold differences, and this is just the production emissions per kilogram of protein in beef. You'd see very similar, almost similar numbers in dairy. The land use efficiencies are even larger. So basically, we need to improve the efficiency. And when you improve the efficiency, meaning more beef per animal, above all, more beef per unit feed, more beef per hectare, you both reduce the land use requirements and you reduce the methane dramatically. This is just the methane. And I will say that when anybody models out some solution to feeding the world without destroying more habitat and forests and all the associated carbon, we basically have to take something like 100 million hectares of grazing land in Latin America and at least triple its output. So this is a huge challenge. Now, the good news is we can do it. Next slide. So, we have improved grazing systems that can dramatically increase output. I just came back from Brazil, and there are clearly systems, and not even overly advanced systems in commercial use. They're getting 5-6 times the output per hectare of kind of a typical system. In other parts of the world, higher quality fodder feeds. The Lewis was involved in the kind of the one above, which is kind of silvopastoral systems, but you don't need to go to silvopastoral systems. Next slide. This is a beautiful picture of the silvopastoral systems, where I'm sure Luz will talk about that more, so I won't steal her thunder. Going to the next slide. Actually, one of the things that's happening as well is that combined with grazing in Brazil, you're seeing some raising of fodder. You're talking about gigantic potential yields. There are even some protein-rich fodder crops that you can get multi times the yield even of corn. You can turn that into silage, use that as part of your feed, and get really dramatically higher output per hectare. So if you go on to the next slide, I'm going to kind of leave you with 2 lessons. Actually, sorry, that one's blank. Please go on. Oh, this would so one. The above, we need to be focusing on pasture improvements. As I said, we basically, there is no solution that doesn't at least triple the output of at least half of the grazing land in Latin America. In other parts of the world, We need to improve the efficiency of feed. And one interesting thing, I'm in the process of working on a paper where we're looking at the efficiency of greenhouse gas emissions for livestock systems in different parts of the world. And to our surprise, when you factor in land use, it turns out that dairy systems in India aren't that bad. You go, really? They're very inefficient. They have a lot of methane per unit of milk. But because they rely overwhelmingly on crop residues, they use very little land. Now, what's the solution going forward? The solution going forward, we come to think, has got to be improved treatment of crop residues. Crop residues have the same potential energy as crops, they're just less digestible. And we think that any solution here is going to require actually having systems that make the crop residues more digestible, because the alternative would have such high land use requirements that actually they would cancel out a lot of the benefits of the reduced methane. Next slide. So I'm going to leave you with two thoughts. One is the only way to do this right is to recognize that in addition to production emissions, we have to increase our output per hectare of land. And that means we have to, in the greenhouse gas calculations, factor in the opportunity cost of land to store carbon. Using land itself has a carbon cost. When you use a hectare of land to produce food, it's not storing carbon. That has a cost. If you don't factor that in, you get distorted ideas like turning cropland into pasture. And you also don't recognize the enormous potential climate benefits of improved pasture efficiency. And if you go, I think I was going to end it here, but I actually had another slide I had added. So let me leave you with two other quick thoughts. One is that even though it's critical to improve these yields, we need to do it in conjunction with forest protection. Overall, when you increase yields, you will spare land globally, but you can end up with situations where you end up clearing more land locally because you get an increased competitive advantage. So my view is that the World Bank should stop doing agricultural projects one place and forest protection projects another place. They need to do it in a combined way. They need to be the same project. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this notion that we have to focus on increasing private finance. So for that 100 million hectares of land in Latin America, just as that example, it takes about $2,000 per hectare to improve it. Do the math, that's $200 billion in investment. That's not going to happen just with public money. The good news is it's profitable. The bad news is it's probably not profitable enough to attract private investment without some additional encouragement. So I think that's another critical angle. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Over to you, Jimmy.
Well, thank you, Priti, and thanks, colleagues, for the opportunity to be here. As I walked into the bank today, I felt rather nostalgic after so many years, and then coming here and seeing all my friends, it's delightful. There's sort of two dimensions of this issue of sustainability, in my view. There's the effect of climate on livestock and livestock on climate. I'll talk almost entirely about livestock on climate and not the reverse, but the reverse is also a big issue with respect to vector dynamics, disease, colonization of new areas, and all these sorts of things. Secondly, I'll talk almost entirely about the context of the developing world. As you look at this subject, you will see the more you aggregate data, it gives one picture that is not necessarily descriptive of all the data sets in there. So it needs a lot of disaggregation, and even at the level of the developing countries, lots of disaggregation is necessary. But nonetheless, I'll talk not about the United States and Canada and so on, but the developing world. So I have sort of three sets of slides in my 10 minutes to sort of reaffirm why this is so important topic. Then some entry points, and then a few slides on we need good baselines. and we don't have them in the context of what is really the livestock impact on the environment, the numbers vary very much depending on who is talking about them. Okay, the currency of development is, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. Livestock contribute directly eight of those goals and indirectly to many more. So put in the context of the SDGs, you can see the impact of this. But more importantly, animal agriculture is 40% of agriculture GDP and growing. And for many developing countries, it could be anywhere between 15 and 80% of GDP. 5 of the top 10 commodities, agricultural commodities, are livestock. Milk and rice alternate about which is the most important commodity depending on prices at any given time. But as you can see from this, livestock commodities are up there. Tim already said this. If you look at this various panels of commodities, you can see that demand in developed countries is not going to grow very much, but it is skyrocketing in most developing countries, all of the commodities. And this is driven by population growth, of course, but mostly by changing incomes. As incomes rise, people consume more animal source foods as they do more fruits and vegetables and so on. So this is very important. As Tim said, demand is going to continue to rise. Importantly, if you look at the developing world, most of this production from livestock is in the hands of smallholders. And so as we think about what we might do, we must consider the interventions in relation to who's doing it now. And this is in Africa and Southeast Asia. This is in the hands of smallholders. Slightly different picture for South America as against Central America and so on. Of course, their livestock has its dichotomies. Important for food and nutrition, but obesity and overconsumption is a concern. Drives economic growth, as I said, 40% of agriculture GDP and growing, but equity is a challenge. Improves human health, contributes to human health through nutrition and so on. But of course, we know the disease challenges, including zoonotics and so on. And whilst managed well, livestock can have some positive impacts on the environment, if not managed well, deleterious. So there's these dichotomies. And therein lies why, reaffirming why this topic is so important. Tim used some of this material, and I want to focus here now that I turn to what might be the entry points. Here is the emissions intensity per unit of protein from livestock. The more purple it is, the higher the emissions per unit of protein. So clearly this issue of reducing emissions intensity is important. We have to raise the productivity of livestock in the developing world. And perhaps the most important thing you can do to cut emissions is this. If you raise the productivity of livestock in developing countries very appreciably, then you reduce the emissions intensity, but also, as Tim said, we will not be adding more animals on the margins to meet this supply, which is rapidly growing. And there are various ways you can raise the productivity of livestock, as we know, at the animal level, at the level of the land and labor and so on. This shows the relationship between, on the one hand, the emission intensity and the level of production on the horizontal. As you can see, the red is really methane. And if you're going to respond to this graph, which shows the relationship between level of production and emissions intensity, then you don't always do the same thing depending on where on this graph you are. Showing here the methane emissions, you can see the share of methane in the contributions of greenhouse gas emissions changes depending on where you are. And therefore, that influences what might be the intervention points as we try to respond to this issue of raising productivity. It's not a one-size-fits-all and for everywhere. More importantly, and this is hinged heavily on what Tim said already, in the developing world, livestock systems are mostly in mixed farming systems. Take out the mauve here, which is the developed world. The rest of this pie is the share of commodities in relation to systems. And as you can see, most livestock systems in the developing world are related to crop. So another intervention point is how do we improve the sort of using crop residues as an input for production. At the present time, we don't consider very much the quality of crop residues as a feed resource. It's just taken for given. Just imagine if you could feed all the rice straws which are burnt in India every year, what an impact that would have, not only on emissions, but on productivity of livestock, especially if we made those crop residues a little bit more digestible, which biologically, technically can be done. So the issue of improving livestock systems and dealing with the issue of sustainability in the developing countries is heavily tied to the mixed systems in which livestock operate. So the input of manure to crops and the output from crops as an input to the livestock. It's a very important dynamic which we must consider. But my favorite topic is perhaps as important as the mixed systems are, we should think a lot about the rangelands. Here we say it's 40%, but in our last work with UNEP, rangelands occupy more than 50% of the surface. Not all of it is used by livestock, but the rangelands where livestock are used have considerable potential to sequester carbon if managed well. So it could be a great vision to make pastoralists not only the producers of meat, which they are in, say, West Africa or in Africa as a whole, but custodians of the environment, payment for environmental services, and so on. Now, those who work in this area talk about the issue of permanence, so that you have rangelands which a hunter comes along and put up in flame overnight. However, the argument is, and the studies seem to suggest, that most of the carbon is sequestered below ground. So the issue of permanence is not as great a barrier as we would think. So because of the sheer size of these rangelands, investments in their management in a way that allow animals to be part of the cycle, because animals are important in the cycle. The faster, the more the animal cut in a proper equilibrium with the plant grows, photosynthesizes, and so on. The cycle is quickened by having animals as against plants just growing and senescing over time. So I believe this is one of the big areas that we should invest in dealing with this. Let me finish my 10 minutes with the issue I talked about. We need good baselines. Depending on who you talk with, you get very different ideas about what is the impact of livestock. And here is an example. We hear a lot about livestock is about 15% or 14% of the greenhouse gas emissions. It depends on whether you're talking about direct emissions, which IPPC uses for most of its calculation for transport and everything else, or you're talking about life cycle analysis. The 15% comes from life cycle analysis, not direct emissions. If you look at direct emissions, it's 5%. and transport is 14, so much higher. People usually say the reverse. Livestock is even higher than transport. That's not true. It depends on the unit of measurement you use. Direct emissions or life cycle. We have no idea, although we have a number for life cycle analysis for livestock, we don't have any idea about the life cycle analysis for the impact of transport, for example. Another place is the impact of water, 15,000 liters for a kilogram of beef you hear. This number comes from feedlot systems, which is only about 10% of the total meat production. So it should not be extrapolated to the whole system. And in any event, is not always potable water. All kinds of water, brown and blue and green, is mixed there. So it's very important. Only 14% of this, only 4% is blue water. The other argument in terms of a baseline is that we hear that so much livestock consume so much of the edible food for people. This study by FAO, including some of our old friends, Casey Han and others here at the bank, shows that only 14% of the grain which is produced is used for livestock. The rest of it is material that no one else could have consumed to produce this. So we need some good baselines in order to set what is the real improvements we can make against which baseline, because this confusion about what we're talking about distorts the argument and allows a lot of loopholes in addressing the topic. Last thing I'd say, we need more investments. If you look at, this is an oldish graph of total GDP, you can see the red on top there is the ODA for agriculture. The green on top of that red is the ODA for livestock. You cannot see it, right? And here is another configuration of it. The red line is the investments in the rest of agriculture. The green line is livestock. 40% of agriculture GDP, but a relatively very, very small amount of the investments, either in ODA or government investments themselves. This needs much more if we're going to tackle this problem of sustainable livestock systems. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you for setting the framework so effectively. You spoke a lot about baselines and the importance of data, which is consistent and coherent. Howard, she has been working relentlessly for quite some time, but he's going to shed some light on the issue from a private sector angle, private financial institutions. So I thought it would be nice and different for us to hear about this as well. So over to you, Howard.
It's muted.
Okay, sorry. Can you guys hear me and see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So my name is Howard Shi, and I'm a technical manager for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI for short. And basically, I guess what I'll be talking about is a brief overview of our near-term target framework for financial institutions and how they should be setting targets to reduce their operational emissions as well as their financed emissions. And how this kind of fits in with the rest of today's session is that, you know, FIs play a key role in the real economy, including in the forest, land, and agriculture sector, or what we call flag sector. And these FIs can align incentives and eliminate barriers for these companies to reduce their emissions. And that's kind of the theory of change that we have. And then maybe some background on the SBTI in general is that it's a collaboration among several organizations such as CDP, the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. And our aim is to drive the private sector to take climate action. And we do this by three things. One is to define and promote best practice in emission reduction targets that are in line with climate science. Second, we provide resources and guidance to reduce barriers to adoption. And third, we independently assess and validate targets. So we do this for companies in the real economy as well as financial institutions. And just want to note that one of the recent resources that SBTI did launch is the FLAG Science-Based Target Setting Guidance, which is the world's first standard for companies in land-intensive sectors to set science-based targets that include land-based emission reductions and removals. So I'm not an expert in this particular field, especially compared to our other speakers today. So I'll, for now, just point to the SBTI website where there is a guidance document, target setting tool, and a recorded webinar and slides available for this particular sector. Otherwise, in a more broader context, the first step for companies and FIs to take climate action is to begin estimating and measuring their emissions. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and PCAF are two leading examples of resources to do this. And while some jurisdictions have started introducing reporting requirements, the broader disclosures in recent proposals around the world, such as from the SEC, are an essential next step for scaling up company climate action. And so where the SBTI comes in, and a key differentiating factor, is our independent assessment and validation of targets. And these are based on public quantitative criteria that have been developed in a inclusive and transparent multi-stakeholder process. And I will just skip ahead some slides to give a brief overview of the particular framework for financial institutions. So essentially, we boiled down the process into 7 steps. So first step is, for the FI to define its organizational boundary and compile its emissions inventory. And then secondly, they will need to determine the scope of the emission of their scope 1 and 2 targets, so their operational targets. And then the third step is for them to decide whether they would like to set optional targets on their scope 3 categories 1 to 14 emissions, so for example, such as from business travel. And these are currently optional because we would like to ensure that FIs focus their efforts on their most material emissions from scope 3, category 15, which is basically its loans and investments. And that leads us to step number 4, where an FI will identify all relevant asset classes that are categorized as required by the SBTI. And next, the FI then proceeds to use relevant methods to develop targets on these required asset classes, which we will discuss in the following slides. And of course, we encourage FIs to go above and beyond the minimum requirements and develop targets and follow recommendations on optional asset classes. So in step number 6, FI would develop its public target language that need to be clear and quantitative, as well as a summary of strategies to achieve its targets. And after a FI's targets are approved by the SBTI, it is then required to announce it publicly in step number 7, and then as well as transparently track and report on its target progress on an annual basis going forward. So that was a very brief overview. So then maybe just zoom in onto step number 4. So an important piece to highlight is its target boundary. And the SBTI here aims to strike the right balance between robustness and practicality. So taking into account, for example, data availability, level of influence, and the sector's contribution to climate change. And table 5.2 of our FI guidance document summarizes which financial sector activities are required, optional, or out of scope in terms of being covered by targets. It also indicates the minimum coverage needed for required activities, as well as the methods that can be applied to each activity. So perhaps some examples. So for example, consumer loans related to residential mortgages are currently optionals. So as such, there is no minimum coverage requirement there, and FIs may cover as much of this activity as they wish. However, if they are covered, the SDA method shall be used, which I'll touch upon in the following slide. Meanwhile, corporate loans, so for example, to companies in the flag sector, they are required to be covered by targets with varying minimum coverage percentages, depending on the borrower, and with all three methods available to be used. Whereas in contrast, sovereign bond investments are currently out of scope, as there are no applicable target setting methods right now, although the SBTI does plan to work on this. So just in terms of methods that I mentioned in step 5, we currently have 3 in for the financial sector, and this links up with what companies in the flag sector would also need to use. And essentially, the first is the sectoral decarbonization approach. And this is a physical intensity-based method, and it essentially looks at tracking reductions in emissions per unit of production. So, for example, an FI can set a target to reduce emissions from the steel sector within its, say, corporate loan portfolio by X% per ton of steel produced over a certain time period. This approach is available for the flag sector for specific commodities. At this point, we do plan on expanding it. Meanwhile, the portfolio coverage approach can be described as a target of targets. It simply requires FIs to engage their portfolio companies to have them set their own SPTs, such that the FI will have 100% coverage of its portfolio by 2040 at the latest. So, for example, an FI can commit to half of its equity investments, setting SPTs by a certain year. So for FIs with portfolio companies in the flag sector, the FI would then be engaging those particular companies to use the aforementioned flag guidance to set targets. And then lastly, the temperature rating approach expands on the portfolio coverage approach, and it enables FIs to assess the ambition of portfolio companies based on their public emission reduction targets. So they don't necessarily have to be validated by the SBTI, just needs to be public. And this approach allows FIs to understand the overall temperature alignment of their portfolios so that they can then engage those portfolio companies towards better temperature trajectories in terms of their targets. So for example, an FI can commit to reducing its portfolio temperature score to 1.5 degrees Celsius by a certain year. And this would require the FI to incentivize or force its portfolio companies to also then set targets that are aligned with 1.5 degrees. This method is supported by additional resources that are available on the SBTI website, including a methodology document, tool user guide, and recorded webinars as well. So I know this was quite a lot of information, so I would recommend taking a look at the SBTI for more information. We have quite a number of resources available there. And if you have any specific questions, also please feel free to reach out to the SBTI financial sector team through our online community, which has a Q&A forum. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Preeti.
Thank you, Howard, and thanks for trying to make those links obvious to the forestry, land, and agriculture sector or the flag. Everybody has different acronyms, so just thought I'd remind everyone what FLAG was. Okay, so we now have Luz. Luz, over to you. Luz, we cannot hear you. I think you're muted. We see your slide. Luz, we cannot hear you. You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Sorry,
yes,
sorry about that, but I don't know why I couldn't.
No.
Okay. No, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone, and thanks, Preeti, for inviting me to share some perspectives on, the efforts to support the development of climate smart livestock systems. Sorry. So now I will start by highlighting that there is a broad spectrum of livestock farming systems globally, in mountains, involving grass, with little grass, intensive, extensive, and so on, urban, peri-urban, and so on. And the implications of that is that there are also a range of associated services, and these services to this broad range of livestock farming systems. In the context of today's discussion, we are focusing very much on these services associated to climate impacts, basically greenhouse gas emissions, and also on the threats that climate change represents for the provision of positive services such as food and nutritional security or livelihoods and economic growth, but also the risk that this climate change represents for, maybe exacerbated the risk of increasing these services. In terms of approaches to design or support the development of climate smart livestock systems, we have been working, we have a range of projects within the bank that are focusing very much on efficiency gains. There are some, these approaches are complementary, but there are some approaches that are focusing on substitution of inputs, for example, as the discussions from earlier speakers in terms of, feed sources, or in terms of fertilizers, replacing synthetic fertilizers by manure or legume and so on. So, but there are other type of approaches that are really more fundamental transformations, and that are really supporting moves from linear approaches to more circular and holistic approaches. And that's the example that I would like to focus on today. And it's basically the efforts that the bank supported for several years in Colombia to transform livestock systems, and that continue today after the project ended about 3 years ago. The baseline for this transformation, the support to this climate smart transformation in Colombia has been really, in Colombia, a lot of the fundamental problems of livestock remain: low productivity, small scale, poor integration, and so on. There are a broad set of livestock production systems with different services and disservices, depending very much also whether they happen within the agriculture frontier or whether they are outside of the agriculture frontier, with a lot of discussions on the impacts of livestock systems, particularly in very vulnerable ecosystems or valuable ecosystems, such as paramos and forest. There is a sector that is also highly impacted by climate change, and of course with differences across different geographical regions and production systems. And you see two little pictures that are at the right side of the screen that try to illustrate some of the efforts that we did trying to identify the risk, the climate risk exposure of different type of livestock systems in Colombia, and also a little bit of understanding on the impacts. So the value proposition to transform the sector in Colombia, or to design climate smart systems, was basically focusing on the sustainable land use transformation via silvopastoral systems. So what the project did was to align incentives, financial incentives through payment for environmental services, and no financial incentives to support to technical assistance and extension services and knowledge generation and dissemination. But the approach was to support a broad range of silvopastoral systems, going from dispersed trees, very, let's say, light approaches to more intensive approaches that involve different stratos, different types of sources of feed, and biomass, and so on. The pillars of this transformation, we could say now, looking backwards, are 4 pillars that were not there at the beginning. This was little by little, they were included in the value proposition as there was better understanding of the challenges that livestock systems were facing in the different contexts. The main entry point for the transformation was the pillar on climate, biodiversity, and natural resources, with a lot of efforts done by the team to understand what are the services that this transformation embrace. So we did a lot of work trying to understand the carbon capture elements of these systems. We supported the definition of emission factors for different models of different type of silvopastoral systems. We focus a lot on understanding how these systems support biodiversity, not only in terms of birds, but also in terms of soil biodiversity, in terms of species, tree species in the landscape. We work a lot also on understanding what were the impacts in terms of other natural resources, such as protection of water sources and so on. In terms of little by little, there was a more understanding on the need to also look at adaptation approaches and how these silvopastoral systems were also contributed to better and more resilient systems. And we did analysis to try to understand how biomass changed during the dry and the wet season compared with silvopastoral systems with no silvopastoral systems. And we also did efforts to try to bring solutions and awareness about the opportunities to enhance resilience and climate resilience. The other pillar that we're talking about, food and nutritional security, and what the effort was focused on here is to really strengthen the links between crop production and livestock production, particularly in the context of family agriculture. You can see some examples here of the kind of systems that were supported. In terms of livelihood and economic growth, this was a very, very important pillar, because we needed to understand what were the benefits that this transformation embraced in terms of better profitability, better income for farmers. So we did a lot of analysis around a set of economic variables and productive variables to understand the implications of different systems so that they can inform also the design of better incentives to support a larger adoption. Another important element that we don't talk, and it was no indicator of the project, we don't talk a lot about is really how this project enhanced rural vitality and involve different stakeholders to be part of the process, a really very active partner in the process, creating awareness from new generations, working with children about the importance of climate smart and sustainable livestock systems, creating opportunities, job opportunities for a lot of young professionals, and bringing this dimension of sustainability and climate dimensions to a better understanding of these dimensions and the way livestock and extension systems for livestock work. and really in general generating opportunities and innovation networks and collaboration and engagement. The other important dimension that also was not from the beginning, that was incorporated gradually as there was more awareness of these aspects, is the animal health and welfare, and really understanding the implications that better pastures, better feeds, more natural solutions for control diseases have in terms of improving welfare, animal welfare elements of livestock production. So in terms of coming in general to understand what were the pillars really of that have been supporting this gradual transformation, I would say there are 5 basically. The first one is really in a strong research and innovation and extension services systems that were anchoring the partners of the institutions that were part of this, the implementation of this project. CPATH was doing research in silvopastoral systems for years and really brought a lot of adaptations and a lot of learning by doing and learning with farmers. And that was really, has been a crucial element of supporting the gains that have been done that have been achieved so far. The other part was the business case, really trying to invest on understanding what were the benefits and what was the business case for farmers, for different actors, the business case of this transformation from an environmental, social, and climate an economic perspective. So we did a lot of analysis to understand those impacts and to communicate those impacts to the different stakeholders. The other aspect was new business models. This transformation involves the gradual, raise of different type of business models, with banks getting involved to pilot climate finance models, with agreements that started to emerge between private associations and municipalities, local governments, to support this transformation. Private companies doing attempts to get engaged and support, if not all, at least some elements of the value proposition that silvopastoral systems were supporting, and really a lot of public-private alliances. And the other element that was very important, and I mentioned before, it was the range of financial and non-financial incentives, and that little by little included also regulatory approaches, such as compensation approaches or the law for payment for environmental services that try to create an some enabling conditions for supporting further the scaling up of these systems. And as I mentioned, collaborative partnerships that keep getting bigger and bigger as new institutions at a national, regional, local level participate into this process. In terms of factors, slowing progress, I think the need, one that is very important, is the need to repurpose policies to really ensure that there is a good alignment between this climate smart and sustainable transformation that is being proposed and the investments that are made to support the sector. There are some timid attempts, but really the incentives to the sector remained strongly supporting traditional livestock systems. There is little to support to research and development systems. And one important aspect that we think is that a lot of the finance is really tied to one specific environmental outcome, whether we are talking about carbon or biodiversity and deforestation, but much less so to integrated outcomes. And another factor that is very important is the short-term expectations of short-term results, which really are not possible when you are supporting transformations of significant shifts in the way systems, production systems are done. So that's an important factor. And just thinking more broadly, beyond the example of Colombia, some aspects or perhaps considerations that we think that are somehow slowing progress in the adoption of a climate smart livestock system. One is really the coherence on policy roles. And we see often discussions where we see the Ministry of Environment claiming that sustainability is under their domain. And what often happens is that it takes away a little bit the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment to embed climate and sustainability objectives as a principle on the way livestock should be done, and therefore as a principle to the support that is to be provided to the sector. So really, this kind of lack of coherency and alignment and coordination does not really support the institutionalization of innovations and the scaling up of these holistic approaches. The other element is really, as I mentioned before, the need for a strong research and development systems. And I am approached quite often the previous point is the tendency to look for single solutions to complex problems. And for that, I am often approached to, provide perspectives on the example of Colombia, but people come always from one perspective. So tell me how I can replicate the best, or how, as if there were a single aspect that determined that this can function. No? It's an integrated approach that needs to look at service development, that needs to look at research and development, that needs to look at input provision. It's really a system approach that needs to look at different dimensions. And the other aspect that we have been, that is an important consideration is in terms of regulatory approaches to support climate smart and sustainable livestock systems, is that often these regulatory approaches have a very narrow focus, often focusing on a single service, whether it is reducing nitrate pollution or promoting deforestation, zero deforestation, supply chain. And this is understandable, but also more integrated approaches, more integration linkages in these regulatory approaches are needed, particularly in the context with livestock. Sectors are still facing significant fundamental problems of productivity, of consolidation, and so on. So these holistic and integrated approaches are much more relevant. And sometimes also there is a poor understanding of the policy impacts. A lot of targets set, but with little understanding on the implications from different stakeholders, and also on the how and the know-how that is required to achieve those targets. So that's all I have to share, and thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Luz. Thanks for perspective from the ground and reality check in terms of what it takes beyond sort of technical knowledge and data, getting all the actors together to for joint cohesive action. Felix, over to you.
Pretty. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Felix Leia. I work within the Livestock Global Expert Team within the Agri-Food Global Practices, and I will talk about how the team supports World Bank operations to enhance their climate-smart livestock contributions. So, to start with a bit of context, the livestock portfolio of the World Bank has been growing quite a lot during the past years and decade. And one could say that the World Bank operations on livestock are already quite climate smart, because they have relatively important climate co-benefits that are actually higher than the average for the whole of the agriculture portfolio. But they will need to be even more climate smart, because the World Bank, and it was a joint agreement between different multilateral development banks to align all their financial flows with the Paris Agreement. So this is actually outlined in the Climate Change Action Plan of the World Bank. And as of July 2023, so pretty soon, all World Bank financed operations will need to align with these Paris agreements. We call that Paris alignment. And another aspect of the Climate Change Action Plan is that agriculture, food, water, and land is considered as a key sector, as a priority for a system transition. So one of the aspects, obviously, of this Paris alignment is include consistency with the country's nationally determined contribution, long-term strategy, and national adaptation plans. And when you look at countries' NDCs in particular, you can see that countries already recognize the important contribution of the livestock sector to climate commitments. A bit more than a third of the country's NDCs already include adaptation and mitigation measures. So this Paris alignment offers a number of opportunities and also challenges for new World Bank operations, an opportunity for the World Bank livestock portfolio to better achieve its potential in terms of sustainability, to transform, to contribute to sustainable food systems. And I will not surprise you by telling that the livestock sector is also under scrutiny due to its impact on the climate change and on the environment, and also on issues such as animal welfare, equity. And this really calls for this Paris alignment to be made with robust and transparent approaches. Some challenges remain regarding Paris alignment and the enhancement of the contribution of the livestock portfolio to climate smart agricultural outcomes. One challenge I see is awareness and the fact that for some of the project teams, there is still this traditional view of really productivity-oriented objectives and not this broader perspective of climate smart livestock. And also something that is possibly lacking are some specific skills and resources and resource allocation at operations level. And one of those specific aspects is around measuring livestock greenhouse gas emission, which is still a bit of a challenge. So the team, one of the things we did to try and tackle some of this challenge was to develop a how-to guide on enhancing climate smart outcomes from livestock system along the World Bank project cycle, and it's also relevant for other IFIs. The context and our starting point for developing this document was to build really on lessons learned from support to various livestock operations in different regions, and that was done within an ASA called the Program on Climate Smart Livestock, where more than $1 billion worth of World Bank investment were supported for measuring and enhancing their climate smart livestock outcomes. The objective of this guide, of this note, is to enable the project task teams to enhance and track their project contributions to climate smart livestock outcomes and to improve their capacity to leverage existing products and tools to, again, support climate smart livestock development. In terms of publication, we are now at the final design stage for this document. It will be available in the coming weeks as a co-publication between the World Bank and FAO that was involved in the support to project teams, and it will also be integrated a bit later in the coming few months into an online guide called Investing in Sustainable Livestock, which I will mention towards the end of my presentation. So just to give you some snapshot example of what this guide contains, there is a lot of content here, but I just want to mention a few things. It looks at the three pillars or the three objectives of climate smart livestock, and particularly at indicators that projects can use to track, to measure those impacts. So in terms of adaptation, looking at indicators that are actions-based. That's what's commonly used by projects. It's just tracking some actions, some activities that we know are relevant for adaptation, but indicators could also reflect systemic characteristics that we know are important for adaptation. You could think of diversification or market access, or even indicators that are based on results that are related to adaptation and resilience, such as the impact of shocks, the time it takes to the system, to beneficiary to recover from such shocks and such results. When it comes to productivity indicators, that's possibly the simplest dimension to address, although there is sometimes a bit of issue in terms of data quality to really get the numbers right in terms of animal numbers and also animal categories, because different animals will not have the same greenhouse gas emissions, for example, getting the number right in terms of production volumes and productivity. And then the last aspect is, and it's probably one of the focus of this guide, because it is possibly the most challenging of the three to measure by operations, and it's mitigation, with here three main types of indicators. Indicators based on emission intensity that we've heard from Jimmy, from Tim. So it's about the emissions per kilogram of protein or per kilogram of output that is produced. Indicators based on absolute emissions, so CO2 equivalents, and indicators based on carbon balance, so taking into account not only the emissions from livestock, but also the potential carbon sequestration in the below ground in grassland systems and above ground in silvopastoral systems, such as those just described by Luz. And so for these mitigation indicators, the guidance, the guide shows different tools, different range of guidance on how to set the baseline. What should the indicators be compared to? Should the greenhouse gas emission results be only on direct emissions, or should they consider the whole life cycle and other aspects? So just to give an overview of the sort of the outline and content when it comes to the initial stage, the project preparation stage, and maybe that's actually the most important, because if things are done right or at the project preparation stage, it really makes things a lot easier for evaluation at midterm review, for example, and at implementation completion at the end of the report, in terms of really setting the baseline right. And so that would involve putting together the team, the task team, the project teams in terms of the livestock experts that would be involved, but also on the client side, who needs to be involved, which stakeholder groups need to be involved. And that relates to the different activities, understanding the context. There is a broad range of production systems, as it was already highlighted, how to really understand that, the specific and context-specific impacts of those systems on climate-smart livestock, how that is linked to define activities, beneficiaries, indicators, and how ex-ante assessments of climate-smart livestock and greenhouse gas emissions should be carried out and should inform also the activities and the beneficiaries of the project. This slide to mention some of the material that we provide in Annex, and Sometimes only a few people read the annex of such reports, but I think in this case the annex contain a lot of useful material, and I'm saying useful because it's material that we often get requests from task teams, such as TORs for livestock production systems or livestock and climate change experts, really list of data, list of parameters that are required for calculating those greenhouse gas emissions, even sample survey forms and budget to enable the task team to really measure those greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to open a small parenthesis here on budget and on the cost of measuring greenhouse gas emissions, because it's often something that is pointed as a challenge. And actually, from our experience and from some of the information that we have in the guide, MRV, so measurement, reporting, and verification of emission, is not necessarily that expensive. On the left and center, you have an example from 2 pilots in Kenya and Colombia that were specifically looking at climate finance. And so it also relates to this payment for environmental services, involvement of the private sector, because the private sectors could be interested in buying some of those carbon credits. And the figures that you see there in terms of the cost of dollars per tons of CO2 equivalent emission reductions are quite low. They're around $1 or less than $1 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And when you compare that to the current price of carbon, let's say as a rough idea, $20 per ton, it's quite low. And so it could the potential challenge of measuring, setting the numbers right, is not necessarily a big limiting factors in accessing this climate finance. The last example is in Ethiopia, and it's about the survey cost for reporting on an emission intensity indicator that is included in the project. And again, you see here figures that are relatively low, around between 2,000 and 6,000 US dollars per region that the project was targeting. So, as I mentioned a bit earlier, the content of this guidance note, the intention is to include that in the Investing in Sustainable Livestock Guide, which is an online tool to, again, guide World Bank operations and other investments to enhance their sustainability. The guide has 3 contributions: environment, which is a bit broader than climate change, but with a bit of a climate change focus, but also animal health, and in the near future, the component of equity and social inclusion that was also mentioned by Jimmy will be integrated. And so for each dimension, there are different principles, 7 principles that propose a structured approach to view how investment decisions, activities will affect the sustainability of livestock projects. Guidance is provided for either the project preparation stage or the implementation phases. And what the user will do is to select a context, select objectives, and then the guide will suggest a number of interventions in accordance with those sustainability principles under environment, animal health, and equity, and provide some specific guidance. So just a snapshot here of some of the objectives that can be selected by the user. With classic objectives for World Bank operations on livestock development, such as improving the productivity of the sector, improving market access, and upstream the input and services delivery, improving specifically climate change resilience and emergency response, and strengthening policies, knowledge, and information. And for these different objectives, the guide will suggest and describe relevant interventions that you can see also here in the slide. I'm just don't want to be too long here, but more to provide you a sort of teaser and encourage you to have a look yourself at this online guide. So just as a few words of conclusion, climate smart livestock is really one of the solutions to shape the trajectory of the sector within the World Bank livestock portfolio, and I would say beyond the World Bank portfolio, because those large-scale investment also have the possibility to impact the sector in countries and to make a significant contribution to the trajectory of the livestock sector as a whole. This Paris alignment of World Bank investment will generate more requirements and will generate new demand on how to measure and how to enhance climate smart livestock impacts, and we're trying to partially respond to that demand with resources such as the Investing in Sustainable Livestock Guide to support operations, and also by providing direct support to operations. And we have a new ASA under which we also provide direct support to operations. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Felix. Thank you also for stepping in for your colleague who was unable to join us today. So this worked out well. So I think we are here with a crowd of people who are genuinely interested in the topic. And I believe there's a first question from Kevin Cleaver, who was the chair of this thematic group up until recently, and also I think everybody knows Kevin. So Kevin, over to you. Would you like to unmute, please?
I think I'm unmuted, and I will my video. Yeah, there we go. So you can see. But my question there, these were terrific presentations. It required a lot of effort to pay attention. But my question that I've written up in the chat box is really directed to Jimmy Smith. Jimmy, when I was listening to you, it struck me that there is a great deal of dissonance between your presentation and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I did not focus on the livestock parts of that, but certainly the message that comes out of the IPCC, and not just the latest reports, but over time, is much more negative about livestock. And in thinking about it, it wasn't that the data was so different. It was the interpretation of that data. Because what you were saying is that a lot of the carbon emissions from livestock production are not from livestock production per se, but rather the transport, the processing, and that therefore the global efforts to reduce meat and dairy consumption by introducing more plant-based diets to the point of inventing new plant-based products which taste like meat and dairy are a waste of time. I mean, that's sort of the conclusion that I would come to from listening to you. And that equally, some of the nutrition complaints about livestock compared to plant-based diets might also be a waste of time. So my sense is that what you have to say, which was very good, I mean, you were very convincing, is a bombshell. Because it suggests that a lot of this global effort to reduce meat and dairy consumption is off the mark, and that what we should be focusing on rather is increasing livestock productivity. So okay. The question is, what do you have to say about this controversy? I'm not denying your data. I know you well,
yeah.
And I find it very interesting. But it seems to me that there is a controversy there.
Well, I'd like to speak on that too.
Yes, we'd welcome your inputs as well after Jimmy.
Okay. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't intending to be painting the picture that is all positive in livestock. That's not the case. But the point I was making is the inconsistent methodology we use in measuring what is the impact on livestock. And the numbers which are used, about this 14%, is a life cycle analysis. FAO, it came out of the Long Shadow book. And since then, FAO itself, Henning Steinfeld and others have gone to pains to explain what was in that book. It was a life cycle analysis. It was not direct emissions. So the point I'm really making is that livestock in the comparison is apple and oranges. On transport and so on, it is direct emissions. It's not how much it takes to get the steel and how much it, and all this sort of stuff. So the contributions livestock is still considerable. There's further controversy. The controversy is that you take the livestock emissions and you convert it all to CO2. Most of the livestock emissions is methane with a half-life of 12 years. CO2 is more than 100. So there's controversies about how you compare these things. More importantly, a lot of the data which is attributable to livestock is an extrapolation of emissions from the developed world, where systems are very different from the developing world. And the work we and others, Ellery and others have done, have shown that in many places, this is over-exaggeration of the contributions of livestock in the developing countries. The growth curve of livestock in most parts of the developing countries is a sawtooth. It goes up, it comes down in the dry season, goes up again. It's upward, but it takes a long time before an adult is reached. It's not the production system in, say, North America, where they're bigger animals, they're always fed, overfed, or fed far beyond maintenance. Livestock in the developing countries fed well below maintenance. So the point I'm making is that there's inconsistent methodology, there is inconsistent interpretation, and so on and so on. Not that livestock's contribution is insignificant. It is significant. But